Let's turn this morning to the Gospel of Luke. We're going to chapter 8. The Bible tells us many stories of people who suffer. And this morning we are going to read about a woman who suffered greatly in a number of areas of her life. And we're going to be going to verse 40 of chapter 8 of the Gospel of Luke. And it says, "Now when Jesus returned, the crowd welcomed him, for they were all waiting for him. And there came a man named Jairus, who was ruler of the synagogue. And falling at Jesus' feet, he implored him to come to his house. For he had an only daughter, about 12 years of age, and she was dying. As Jesus went, the people pressed around him. And there was a woman who had a discharge of blood for 12 years. And though she had spent all her living on physicians, she could not be healed by anyone. She came up behind him and touched the fringe of his garment, and immediately her discharge of blood ceased. And Jesus said, 'Who was it that touched me?' When all denied it, Peter said, 'Master, the crowds around you and surround you and are pressing in on you.' But Jesus said, 'Someone touched me, for I perceive that power has gone out from me.' And when the woman saw that she was not hidden, she came trembling, and falling down before him, declared in the presence of all the people why she had touched him, and how she had immediately been healed. And he said to her, 'Daughter, your faith has made you well. Go in peace.'" The Bible tells us that for 12 long years, this woman had suffered in this way physically. You think about that. Break it down to how we understand time. 12 seems like a small number. But you think of 12 years and you're talking about 4,383 days. Day after day, she was faced with this. Talking about 144 months, 624 weeks, 105,192 hours that this woman had to live with this. This, as the Bible, many translations say, this issue of blood. And because of this, she was considered by everyone around her as being unclean. Nobody could approach her. She could approach nobody. The family that she once knew had to avoid her and stay away from her. We don't know whether she was married or not, but if she was married, she could have no contact whatsoever with her husband. For 12 years, considered unclean, could not be touched by a clean person, because then that person would be ostracized and considered contaminated as well. Could not go to the assemblies, could not go to the synagogues, could not enter into the temple area, could not take part in any of the ceremonies that everybody else took part in. It had been 12 years since she had celebrated the Passover or the Sabbath with everyone else. 12 years since she had been able to stand before the high priest to offer up a sacrifice and find forgiveness in their way of sin during the time of Yom Kippur. 12 years that she bore not only this physical stigma, but this emotional and psychological baggage that had been piled on to her over time. She was a desperate woman. She had tried everything, the Bible says. She had gone to all the physicians seeking help from them, and I'm sure that she went to other areas to find some type of relief, some type of escape from this issue of blood. The Talmud, which is the written record of Jewish oral traditions that passed down a lot of not only the traditions, but a lot of the cures that people look to help them out in some of the physical issues that they had in life. In regards to the issue of blood, this is what the Talmud said that she needed to do, and probably tried a number of these things. The Talmud says that if one has an issue of blood, you need to take the gum of Alexandria, the weight of a small silver coin. You need to take some alum of the same weight, and you bruise them or you mix them together and give it in wine to the woman that has the issue of blood. She is to drink this. And hopefully that will cure her. But if that does not cure her, if this doesn't benefit her in a way, she is to take 3 pints of Persian onions, boil them in wine, give it to her to drink, and as you give it to her to drink, you say, "Arise from thy flux." And hopefully this would cure her. If this didn't work, then she was to go to a place where, kind of a fork in the road, that 2 different paths meet where she is at. Go to that place, let her hold a cup of wine in her right hand, let somebody come up behind her and frighten her and say, "Arise from thy flux." You know, it's kind of like that joke, go to the full moon, swing a chicken in front of, above your head, and then bury the chicken in the backyard. That's kind of what it sounds like to us. There were additional cures that included carrying the ashes of an ostrich egg in a linen bag during the summertime, or carrying the ashes of an ostrich egg in a cotton bag during the winter. Carry around barley corn that was found in dung from a white female donkey. Eating grasshopper eggs. Carrying around the tooth of a fox. The fingernail of a person who has been hanged. These were all cures, all these old wives' tales that have been handed down from generation to generation that would help a person with the issue of blood. She had tried all the physicians, and when they couldn't do anything, I am sure that she went up to all of these old traditions handed down through history that would help her to deal with this that she had been struggling with for 12 long years. She is depressed. She is desolate. She is desperate to do something about this in her life. And then she hears about Jesus. And she hears that Jesus is coming to her area. The news has traveled ahead of him of the direction that he is going, and it has reached her ears that perhaps this one who people are proclaiming has been healing people, maybe where the physicians couldn't do it, where these old traditions could not do it, maybe, just maybe, Jesus can help her out with this situation. Maybe he can heal her. And you can imagine as this crowd is coming into town and going through the town, she is rushing to where he is at, and to her horror finds that there is this great crowd that surrounds him. Now remember, because she has this issue of blood, she is unclean. Because she has this issue of blood, she cannot come into contact with people. And Jesus is surrounded by people. How is she going to do this? I can imagine that what she did, hoping that nobody would recognize her, she took a shawl and draped it over her head to hide her face. The people in the town certainly knew who she was. Certainly the alarm would go out just as soon as she would approach, and going through the crowd to get to Jesus, who was probably at the center of the crowd or at the front of the crowd. She was going to have to weave through people. She was going to have to bump into people. She was going to have to touch people. And everyone she would touch was unclean. So probably hiding her face so that nobody will recognize her, going into the crowd at a crouch. And as she approaches Jesus, she hears him talking to somebody. And she looks up, and Jesus is conversing with a man by the name of Jairus. And Jairus' daughter was at the point of death. And he has come to Jesus, the leader of the synagogue, asking Jesus, "Come and heal my daughter." And she stops in her tracks. Because Jairus is somebody. He's important. He's the leader of the synagogue. People look up to him. And she is nobody. She has been the person that people have been avoiding for 12 years. How she must have felt. And she thinks to herself, there is no way I can get to Jesus and talk with him while he's dealing with somebody important. If I can just crawl in there and touch the hem of his garment. Just maybe. Now, there's a reason she picks that. The Jews wore these cloaks, and at the bottom of these cloaks were tassels. And depending upon these individuals, whoever it was that wore the cloak, whether you might call it superstition, many of the people saw these tassels as sacred objects. And so here is Jesus, this great teacher, this great healer, who is walking through. She's never going to get to him. She's never going to converse with him. If she could just reach the hem of the garment where the tassels hang and touch one of those, if it is truly a sacred object, if she will just touch that, maybe, just maybe, her last chance out of everything she's tried, she can be cured of this issue of blood. And so that's exactly what she does. She crouches in, head covered, reaches down, touches the tassel, and in doing so, she feels that she has been healed. And you recognize that by what she says later on in the Scripture. And again, not wanting to call attention to herself, you can imagine, she turns and begins to make her way away from Jesus. She has come, and exactly what she was seeking, she has felt it. This issue of blood is gone. Physically, she can feel that it is no longer an issue in her life. So what she came seeking, she has received. She turns and begins to secretly make her way from the crowd. There's just one problem. Jesus turns and says, "Who touched me?" And you can imagine her stopping dead in her tracks. Now, of course, a lot of people come forward. Peter especially comes forward and said, "Lord, look at the crowd around you. Everyone's touching you. They're bumping into you. They can't help but touch you. There are so many people." And you can imagine her thinking, "Yes, maybe I'll still go undetected." And Jesus says, "No, it's not like that." He says, "I have felt power released from me." She couldn't hide. And she has to turn to Jesus. And probably takes the shawl from her head. And I can imagine the gasp of the crowd that recognize her, thinking to themselves, and probably muttering and shouting, "Unclean!" as she confronts the one who has brought her this physical healing in her life, who has done more than physicians have been able to do, who has done more than all those cures that she had read about in the Talmud. This one has brought physical healing, has taken away that which she has suffered with for 12 long years. And in fear and trembling, I imagine she comes and throws herself at the feet of Jesus. Now, I imagine she does that, and I think she does that for one reason. What if he takes this away from me? He so easily cured me. What if Jesus takes this cure away? Because in essence, I have stolen it from him. He recognizes this power has escaped from him. What if he wants that power back? And I have felt just a few moments of cure, and now I'm facing the possibility of having this disease for the rest of my life. And Jesus looks at this trembling woman and says in Luke 8:48, "Daughter, your faith has healed you. Go in peace." Your faith has healed you. Go in peace. There are a lot of people who have taken this scripture, and I believe taken it too far. And they have said, what do we need doctors for? If you have enough faith, Jesus can heal you. And I believe Jesus still heals. But there are many who believe that we have absolutely no need for doctors anymore. If you have enough faith, you will be healed. If you don't have enough faith, the disease, whatever it may be, will take you. In northern Indiana, a man by the name of Hobart Freeman, right there, taught his people in his congregation that, listen, if you had enough faith, you don't need doctors. In fact, he viewed it as a sin if you even went to a doctor to seek any type of cure whatsoever. And he used this passage, he preached this passage for that point. That it happened this way then, it happens this way now, and because this woman found no use in doctors whatsoever, there is absolutely no use for doctors in our day and age. This woman had spent all her money, she had wasted her money and wasted her time. And anyone that uses them today are doing the exact same thing as what he would preach and what he would teach. Before his ministry was over, 90 people died, where they could have been treated and cured by physicians. 90 people died. And I guess if you were to ask him and others in that congregation, they would have said, well, they just didn't have enough faith. Hobart Freeman himself died of pneumonia. Complicated heart failure, complicated by an ulcerated leg. Things that could have been treated. And yet died from them. Did he die because he did not have enough faith? That would have been a sad situation. I don't believe that's what Jesus is teaching here. I believe that God has given individuals gifts and talents in order to help us physically in our lives. God heals in a number of ways. He can miraculously heal, just as we see in this scripture, and He can use physicians. Came across an interesting survey, however, dealing with doctors. Survey said that contacted doctors and asked them, 74% of doctors in the U.S. believe that divine miracles of healing have and continue to occur. 73% said they believe that they still occur today, even with all the advancement that we have in medicine. A lot of the doctors say, yes, miracles occur, because you go to 55%, over half the doctors say they had personally seen medical results in a patient that they could only describe as miracles. They had people under their care that they said, well, this individual is not going to make it. And all of a sudden they recover. All things pointed to the fact that they were going to die, but somehow, not because of what the doctors had done or what the medicines had done, but something had to happen in their lives that they lived. And the doctors will say and shrug their shoulders and say, we don't understand it, but there must be something else at work here. A lot of them won't admit it's God. But when they're stumped, all they can say is, well, something else had to happen. And many will say, and I think those that are believers say that, yeah, things do happen. And all we can call it is a miracle that it has happened in their lives. God still performs miracles. And God uses doctors. But there are a couple of lessons I think that we are really pointed to here. Not the fact that doctors are no good, or that we shouldn't have doctors, and that if you use a doctor you don't have faith. I don't think that's the lesson. But I think there's a couple lessons here. First lesson I think that we can take from this is that this woman's suffering had an effect on her life. Definitely. What she was going through physically affected her. in what she was facing and going through in life. Look again at verse 43 of chapter 8. There was a woman who had a discharge of blood, or this issue of blood, for 12 years, and she had spent all her living on physicians. 12 years. 12 long years. How could that not affect somebody? 12 years of being ostracized, of being ignored, of being told you're unclean, of not being able to come into worship. You know, if there is another lesson here, we take worship for granted. We have the greatest privilege to come here and to worship our God. And here was one who was forced from worshiping God because of a physical ailment that she had in her life. She couldn't worship. She couldn't go to the ceremony. She couldn't offer the sacrifice for her sin. She was just cast aside. How does that not affect somebody in their lives? You may remember the gentleman by the name of Terry Anderson. Terry Anderson was held by Lebanese rebels for several years. And he was finally freed. Spent a long time in isolation while in captivity. He couldn't see his wife. He couldn't see his children. In regards to worship, he couldn't worship the God that he loved because of the Muslim influence that held him captive. He was constantly threatened, constantly told that this day your life is going to end, only to have the day end rather than his life. He was deprived of many of the most basic needs of his life for several years. And this is what he had to say about his experience. He said, "We come closest to God at our lowest moments. It's easier to hear God when you are stripped of pride and arrogance, when you have nothing to rely upon except God. It's pretty painful to get to that point. But when you do, God's there. When you get to that point, you'll find God." Here's a woman who has gone through everything. 12 long years of isolation. 12 long years of people turning their backs on her, denying her existence, considering her unclean. Where could she go? Doctors? Old wives' tales? No. Old home cures? None of them worked. There's Jesus. She'd heard about Jesus. When she got to her lower point, got probably to where this couldn't affect her any more than it already had, she heard about Jesus and made her way to Him. Suffering can have a profound effect on us. You know that. You look at people around you who are suffering and how it affects them. You look at your own life, the suffering that you face, and how it can affect you. How things will arise in your life and take you down so quickly. Doesn't take 12 years for most of us. It just takes, in many cases, just a few moments of suffering to bring us down to our lowest point. Suffering affects us. It affected this woman. But always remember, suffering, the Bible tells us, has a purpose. And it can bring us closer to God. It brought this woman closer to Jesus. This woman's suffering had an effect on her, and she learned an important lesson that we can learn, that Jesus can give exactly what is needed to our lives. And yes, you can try doctors, and God uses them, and sometimes He doesn't. You can try some of the remedies that you heard from your mother and grandmother. Some of those work pretty good on bee stings and things like that, but some of the bigger issues that you have in life, they really don't have any effect at all. But there's always Jesus. Jesus is always there Jesus is waiting for you. And Jesus heals this woman. In fact, He's already healed her. When it comes to what she really needs in her life. She was just a common woman. Nobody wanted to be around her. And Jesus could have done anything at this point to help her. He does. He heals her physically. But rather than allowing, Jesus knew what happened. Let's not fool ourselves. She comes up behind him quietly, touches the garment. She feels the healing. She turns, makes her way out of the crowd. Jesus could have said, she's been healed. Praise you, Father. And just let her go. She had gotten what she came for, right? What did Jesus do? He turns and He faces the woman. And He says, somebody has touched me. She'd gotten what she wanted. Jesus had something else to give her. And in order to do that, He had to put her in the spotlight. And that's exactly what He does. He puts her in the spotlight. He chooses to do this. She wanted nothing more than to slip away through the crowd and to make her way home. She didn't want the attention. They still considered her unclean, whether she felt the cleansing or not. She didn't want the attention. She didn't want to make a public speech about or give testimony about what had happened to her. She just wants to get out of there. She wants to go home. She wants to get on with her life. She has been cleansed of that which has tormented her all these years. But Jesus had something else in mind. And Jesus turns to her and He says, somebody has touched me. Something other than that physical condition that had driven her there. It was an uncleanness, not physically, but spiritually. Look at verse 48 again. And He says to her, after confronting her, daughter, your faith has made you well. Go in peace. Now we look at that and our focus is upon the physical healing. Your faith has made you well. It goes deeper than that. Jesus had already healed her physically. He had performed the task. He had done the job. He could have let her go, but there was something else inside. Something that she had been burdened with all that time. She could not go to the synagogue. She could not go to the temple. She could not offer up sacrifices for her sin. She had been burdened not only physically, she had been burdened spiritually, emotionally by what everyone had been saying about her, but spiritually in her walk with God. The job was only half done. And Jesus completes the task. What you have done, your faith has healed you, not just physically. He did that. Spiritually. What you needed most of all, daughter, has been taken care of. That which has really burdened you, God is taking care of it. Your faith has healed you. You've been forgiven. Go in peace. That issue of blood, that which she has lived with, that isolation that she has felt, experienced from day to day, had ruined her life. And now Jesus had put an end to all that. Great lesson that we learn here is the value of coming to Jesus. Not just with the physical needs that we have, but coming to Jesus in regards to what we suffer with emotionally and what we suffer with spiritually. He takes the damaged life, the life that has been affected by all these things, and He remakes that life in His image. He heals us in a way that makes us realize that nothing else could have done it. Helps others to see that nothing can affect our life like Jesus can. You may be here this morning, and you're struggling in your life, and so much has affected you. Emotionally, physically, spiritually. You go to doctors physically. You go to psychiatrists emotionally. You go to all these different places and you're looking for relief. You're looking for something to take that away, that pain that you feel. And people go through their entire lives burdened by it. And they forget the one that can really do something about it. Jesus Christ. You may go to the doctor. And the doctor may look you in the eye and say, you know, I have no explanation for this, but what you were suffering with, it's no longer there. All I can describe it as is a miracle in your life. And you go out the door and you're so thankful. But if you go out the door and that's all that's happened, you've only been healed part way. You need to go to the one that brought that healing. You need to go to Jesus. Because He wants to take care of more than just the physical. He wants to take care of the spiritual. And He'll do that for you today. No matter what you're suffering with. What your affliction is. He may not miraculously remove it. We have instances in the Bible that didn't happen. Some of the most godly people. But He'll help you with what you're going through. He'll walk with you every step of the way. He has promised. He will never leave you or forsake you. If today you will just give your life to Him. Let's bow our heads.